6 little bodies were still. They lay under the hot Arizona sun. Big birds called buzzards were already flying in circles above them. It was like they were death's own helpers. The oldest girl, maybe 14 years old, held a rusty water bottle. It hadn't had water in 2 days. Her dry lips moved, saying a quiet prayer. The youngest, a boy no older than 4, had stopped crying many hours ago. It was a silence scarier than any shout. Minerva Blackwood saw the broken wagon from half a mile away. The wagon looked like a broken bone against the huge desert. Its cloth roof was ripped up by wind and time. She had been looking for wild horses when a shiny piece of metal caught her eye. But now, her rough hands held the horse's reins tighter. In 15 years of living alone in the middle of nowhere, she had learned that other people's problems could become her own big trouble. But something about the scene made her feel a pull in her chest. Maybe it was how still everything looked. Or maybe it was the way the buzzards kept landing and flying off, like they weren't even sure their meal was ready. She thought about turning her horse around and riding back to her ranch. There, the only voices she heard were her own and the wind through broken shutters. After losing her husband, Samuel, and their boy Jacob, to a bad Apache attack 5 years ago, she had promised herself she wouldn't care about anything alive. But here she was, making her horse go forward through the very hot air. The closer she got, the clearer it became. These weren't just any travelers. This was a family wagon, the kind that carried everything someone owned in the world. Clothes were spread around like dry weeds, and a child's wooden toy was half buried in the sand. And worst of all, the shapes that hadn't moved since she first saw them. The oldest girl's eyes snapped open when Minerva's shadow fell on her face. Those eyes showed a mix of hope and fear that made Minerva's stomach twist. The girl tried to speak, but only managed a hoarse whisper that sounded like please. Behind her, 5 other children lay, some awake, some not. Their small bodies already showed the terrible signs of being in the desert too long. Minerva got down from her horse, her boots hitting the sand with a soft thud. She had seen death before, a lot of it, but something about these children made her chest feel like it was being crushed in a tight squeeze. The girl who'd opened her eyes was clearly the oldest. She had sun-bleached hair and a face that had aged years in what couldn't have been more than days. She wore a torn blue dress that might have been pretty once. Her arm was wrapped around a smaller child, who couldn't have been more than 6, keeping them safe. Water, that's what they needed first. But Minerva only had enough in her water bottle for maybe 2 of them. In this heat, sharing it might save them all, or kill them all. Her hand went to the water bottle at her hip, while her mind raced through ideas. Her ranch was 8 miles east, but these children couldn't make that trip in their condition. Leaving them here to get help meant risking that she'd come back to find dead bodies. But as she looked at their faces, some peaceful because they were unconscious, others twisted with pain, she realized the choice had already been made, not by her mind, but by something deeper that she'd thought died with her own family. She opened her water bottle and knelt beside the oldest girl, tipping the bottle toward those very dry lips. The girl drank fast, water running down her chin, as her body remembered what it felt like to be alive. When she'd had enough, she grabbed Minerva's wrist with surprising strength and pointed to the smaller children. No words were needed. Minerva understood. Save them first. But as Minerva moved to the next child, she heard something that made her blood freeze. Horse hoofbeats in the distance, coming fast from the north. In this part of the land, riders moving that fast usually meant one of 2 things: outlaws running from the law, or something worse, hunting for easy targets. The riders appeared from the heat shimmer like demons from hell itself. 3 men on horseback, their faces hidden behind bandanas, and their guns already out. Minerva's hand moved on its own to the rifle on her horse. But she was caught in the worst spot, kneeling beside the children, completely open with nowhere to run. The main rider stopped 30 feet away, close enough for Minerva to see the mean smartness in his eyes, above the dirty cloth covering his mouth. His horse snorted and stomped, feeling the tension that popped between them like lightning before a storm. The other 2 spread out to the sides, a move that showed they had experience in situations like this. Minerva slowly stood up, keeping her hands where they could be seen, but ready. She had stayed alive this long in dangerous land by reading men like weather patterns. And everything about these 3 screamed danger. The way they sat their horses, the easy confidence of their gun hands, the fact that they'd come up to a lone woman in the desert without thinking twice. None of it meant anything good. The leader spoke first, his voice rough like sandpaper. Well, what do we have here? A regular angel of mercy, it looks like. His eyes moved from Minerva to the children spread around the broken wagon. And his tone changed to something that made her skin crawl. Mighty convenient, finding all these little ones out here with nobody to look after them. The oldest girl, the one who'd grabbed Minerva's wrist, tried hard to sit up, even though she was weak. Her eyes darted between the armed men and Minerva, smartness burning bright even in her bad condition. She understood the danger, even like she was, and Minerva saw her move closer to the smaller children. It was as if her 14-year-old body could somehow protect them from what was coming. Minerva kept her voice steady, though every part of her wanted to grab her rifle, just passing through, and saw the wagon. These children need water and medical attention. She pointed toward her horse. I've got supplies that might help. The second rider, a skinny man with nervous eyes, laughed at something that wasn't funny. Supplies, she says. Jack, you think she's got the kind of supplies we're looking for? His gaze stayed on the children in a way that made Minerva's blood boil. But she made herself stay calm. Anger would get them all killed. Jack, who was apparently the leader, moved his horse closer. Funny thing about this territory, Lady dangerous for folks traveling alone, especially with valuable cargo. His meaning was clear as desert air, and Minerva felt her jaw tighten, even though she tried to look harmless. The third man, quiet until now, finally spoke up. His voice had a different sound, educated, which somehow made him more scary than the others. The question is, what's a woman like you doing out here alone? This isn't exactly a place for Sunday rides. His horse stepped sideways, getting into a spot to cut off any way to escape to the east. Minerva realized with growing fear that these men weren't just random bad guys. They moved too well together, asked too many specific questions. Either they'd been watching her ranch, or they knew exactly who she was and what her being here meant. The thought that they might have been following her, waiting for exactly this kind of chance, made her stomach turn. The oldest girl made a small sound, half cough, half plea, and tried to speak. Please, she managed. The word was barely loud, enough to hear, but it carried the heavy weight of 6 lives hanging in the balance. Jack's attention shifted to her, and his eyes got narrow with the kind of focus that predators use for hurt prey. But as the standoff got tighter than a bowstring, Minerva heard something else cutting through the desert silence. Another set of hoofbeats, coming fast from a different direction. The question was whether someone was riding to save them, or if their nightmare was about to get even worse. The approaching rider wore the star of a territorial marshal, but instead of feeling relieved, Minerva felt her blood turn to ice water. Marshal Cade Brennan had a bad name that stretched from Tucson to Santa Fe, not for fairness, but for the kind of law enforcement that came with a price tag. His being here in the middle of nowhere wasn't a coincidence. Jack and his men immediately moved their positions, but they didn't put their guns away. The fact that they weren't running told Minerva everything she needed to know about who was really in charge here. Brennan stopped his sweating horse and looked at the scene with the cold calculation of a man counting money. Gentlemen, Brennan said, tipping his hat in a fake polite way. His voice had the smooth confidence of someone who'd never met a situation he couldn't make money from. And the lovely Mrs. Blackwood. Fancy meeting you out here in such interesting circumstances. The way he said her name made Minerva's skin crawl. Brennan knew exactly who she was, which meant he'd been planning this meeting. Her lonely ranch, her name for staying away from town and people, her sad past that kept her open to danger and alone. It all made perfect sense now. These children weren't just victims of bad luck. They were bait at. The oldest girl's breathing had become shallow and fast. Minerva could see her trying hard to stay awake, to keep watch over her brothers and sisters. Even as her body started shutting down from not enough water and being out in the sun too long, the sight of this 14-year-old fighting to protect children who couldn't protect themselves sent a familiar anger burning through Minerva's chest. The same fury she'd felt watching Apache warriors ride away from her burning home 5 years ago. Brennan got off his horse very slowly, his spurs jingling in the desert silence. You know, Mrs. Blackwood, there's been some concern about your well-being, living alone out there. No family, no protection. Some folks think it might be time for you to consider a change of scenery. The pieces fit together in Minerva's mind, like bullets sliding into a gun. Her ranch sat on very good water rights, the kind that big cattle companies would kill for. With her dead, the land would go to a government sale, probably for much less than it was worth. And who better to set up such a convenient accident than a bad marshal and his hired guns? Especially, Brennan continued, walking closer to the children, when there are innocent lives at stake. These poor orphans need proper care, don't you think? A woman alone in the wilderness can't possibly provide the kind of protection they require. One of the smaller children, a boy maybe 7 years old, started to whimper softly. The sound seemed to make something happen in the oldest girl, who somehow found the strength to pull him closer despite her own condition. Her fierce protectiveness reminded Minerva so strongly of her own motherly feelings that it felt like a physical hit. Jack's nervous partner spoke up, his voice eager with excitement. Marshall's right. Lady Desert's no place for children. Lucky for them, we know some folks who specialize in taking care of orphans. Real profitable kind of care, if you catch my meaning. The meaning hit Minerva like a heavy hammer. These weren't just land grabbers. They were traffickers. The children weren't just people who saw what happened and needed to be gotten rid of. They were stuff to be sold. And Minerva had walked right into their trap. But as Brennan reached down toward the oldest girl, his intentions very clear. Something inside Minerva snapped with the sound of a breaking bone. Minerva's hand moved faster than desert lightning. Her Colt .45 gun came out of its holder and shot once, the gunshot echoing off distant canyon walls like thunder. Brennan's hat flew backward as the bullet went past his hair by less than an inch, close enough that he could feel the heat of it. The bad marshal froze, his hand still reaching toward the girl. Every man there understood the message. The next shot wouldn't be a warning. Minerva's name with a gun wasn't just old stories from the frontier. She'd learned to shoot from Comanche raiders who taught her that waiting meant death for everything you loved. Touch one of these children, Minerva said, her voice carrying the quiet certainty of a loaded gun, and I'll paint this desert with your brains. The barrel of her Colt gun never moved, pointed right at Brennan's forehead. Around them, the other 3 men moved nervously, but none were foolish enough to draw their guns on a woman who'd just shown she could part a man's hair from 20 paces away. Jack's educated friend spoke carefully, his fancy voice tight with controlled fear. Mrs. Blackwood, you're making a serious mistake. Marshal Brennan represents territorial law. Threatening an officer is a hanging offense. Minerva's laugh had no humor at all. Law. The only law I see here is for men planning to murder a woman and sell children like cattle. Her finger squeezed a little tighter on the trigger, and Brennan's face went pale under his sunburnt skin. Question is, which one of you wants to die first? Testing my resolve. The oldest girl used the distraction to pull herself closer to the smaller children, putting her body between them and the men, despite her weakness. Her eyes burned with fierce determination that reminded Minerva of her own mother, a woman who protected their home against attackers with nothing but a shotgun and pure stubborn will. But Minerva knew she couldn't keep this standoff going forever. 4 against 1, even with surprise on her side, wasn't something she could keep up. Her horse stood 20 feet away with her rifle, but reaching it meant showing her back to armed men who'd already shown they had no morals. The children needed immediate medical help, but every second this fight continued was a second closer to someone making a deadly mistake. If you were Minerva, what would you do? Trust that her name would make these men back down and risk them not believing her, or start shooting and guarantee a gunfight with 6 dying children caught in the middle? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you choose, because what Minerva decided next would determine whether she'd become their savior or their executioner. Brennan slowly raised his hands, but his eyes had the calculating look of a man buying time rather than giving up. Easy now, Mrs. Blackwood, no need for bloodshed. Maybe we can work out some kind of arrangement, beneficial to everyone involved. The skinny rider with nervous eyes started moving his horse sideways, trying to get a good angle on Minerva, without her noticing. But she'd been watching for exactly that kind of movement, and her side vision caught his small shift. In the desert, staying alive meant noticing every shadow, every change in the land, every detail that didn't belong. The arrangement is simple, Minerva replied, tracking the nervous rider's movement without taking her main aim off Brennan. You fall right out of here and never come back. I take these children to safety, and we all pretend this conversation never happened. The youngest child, the 4-year-old boy who'd stopped crying hours ago, suddenly made a small sound and went completely limp. His tiny body wasn't moving anymore, and the oldest girl's face crumpled as she realized what was happening. Time was running out faster than water through sand, and every second spent in this standoff was a second these children didn't have. But as Minerva felt the weight of impossible choices crushing down on her shoulders, she heard a sound that changed everything, the special whistle of an Apache war cry coming from the rocks above them. The Apache war cry cut through the desert air like a knife. instantly turning enemies into unwilling friends. 5 warriors came out from behind rock formations where they'd been watching the fight happen. Their faces were painted for war, and their weapons were ready for blood. In the harsh math of staying alive on the frontier, Apache attackers were always better than bad lawmen and land grabbers. Brennan's face went from pale to ashen gray. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, his hand moving on its own toward his gun before remembering that Minerva's gun was still pointed at his head. The nervous rider's horse started dancing sideways, feeling its rider's fear, while Jack cursed under his breath and looked wildly for escape routes that didn't exist. Minerva's mind raced through possibilities, all of them bad. The Apache had probably been following Brennan's group, waiting for the right moment to attack. Her being here with dying children just made the situation more complicated and more dangerous. Apache warriors didn't usually take prisoners, especially not when they had more men than their enemies and were on higher ground. The oldest girl somehow found enough strength to speak, her voice barely a whisper, but carrying desperate urgency. "Please, the little ones." She was looking directly at Minerva, trusting her to make the right choice, even as death came from many directions. The weight of that trust felt heavier than mountains. The main Apache warrior, a man with scars across his chest that showed he'd survived many battles, raised his rifle and shouted something in his native language. Whatever he said made his companions spread out along the ridge, getting into positions to create a killing field with no escape. These weren't young hotheads looking for glory. These were experienced fighters who knew exactly how to get rid of threats efficiently. Brennan tried to sound like he was in charge, even with his voice shaking. "I'm a territorial marshal. Attacking me is an act of war against the United States government." The Apache warrior's response was a laugh that had no warmth at all, followed by words in English that were perfectly clear. "Your government means nothing in our land, Tinstar man." The 4-year-old boy who'd gone limp suddenly gasped and started breathing again. But his tiny chest moved in irregular ways that suggested his body was fighting a losing battle. The oldest girl pressed her ear to his chest, tears streaming down her sunburnt cheeks as she listened to his heart. Try hard to keep beating. Minerva realized with clear understanding that traditional options were gone. Running meant leaving the children to definitely die. Fighting meant a 5-way gun battle with kids caught in the middle. Giving up meant trusting Apache warriors who had every reason to hate white settlers, especially considering what had happened to her own family 5 years ago. But as she watched the oldest girl desperately trying to keep her little brother alive, something clicked in Minerva's memory. The main Apache warrior's scars, the way he held his rifle, even his laugh. She'd seen him before, not in battle, but in a moment of unexpected kindness that had saved her life when her husband and son were killed. If you're loving this story so far, hit that subscribe button because what happens next will blow your mind. The warrior's eyes met hers across the deadly distance, and she saw the exact moment when he recognized her in his dark gaze. The Apache warrior's name was Nalish, and 5 years ago he'd been the one to pull her from the burning remains of her home, while his war party finished destroying everything she'd loved. But instead of killing her, he'd whispered something in Apache that she'd never understood, touched the silver locket around her neck that held her son's picture, and simply walked away. Now he stood 40 feet above them on the rocky ridge, his weathered face showing the same strange mix of recognition and planning that had saved her life once before. The other warriors looked to him for orders, their rifles aimed at the group below, like vultures waiting for a signal to feast. "Now," called out in accented English, his voice carrying across the desert with clear authority. "Woman with dead son's memory." He pointed toward the locket that still hung around Minerva's neck, catching sunlight like a signal mirror. "You should not be here with Tin Star men who steal children." Brennan tried to speak, his voice cracking with desperation. "These children are under territorial protection. I'm bringing them to proper authorities." But Nalish's scornful snort suggested he understood exactly what kind of protection a corrupt marshal offered innocent kids. The oldest girl suddenly spoke up, her voice weak but determined. "My name is Emma. These are my brothers and sisters. Our parents died 3 days ago when our wagon broke down." She pointed toward the wreckage behind them. "This lady, she's the first person who tried to help us." Something in Emma's tone, the fierce protectiveness despite her own condition, seemed to connect with Apache culture valued courage above almost everything else. And this 14-year-old girl was showing more bravery than the 4 armed men who'd been planning to take advantage of her family's tragedy. Jack's educated friend made a fatal mistake by slowly reaching for his gun, apparently thinking the Apache attention was focused elsewhere. Nalish's rifle swung toward him with smooth, easy movement, and his voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more threat than any shout. Move that hand 1 more inch, book reader, and vultures will feast on your eyes tonight. The man's hand froze halfway to his gun holster, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the fact that the sun was beginning to go down toward the western horizon. Time was running out in more ways than one. These children needed medical help that none of them could provide in the middle of dangerous territory. Minerva made a decision that went against every way she'd learned to survive over 15 years of living on the frontier. She slowly put her gun back in its holster and raised both hands, speaking to Nalish directly. These children will die without help. I have medical supplies at my ranch, 8 miles east. Let me take them there. Nalish studied her face for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to look straight through her soul. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of old wisdom, mixed with hard-earned practical sense. White woman who lost everything speaks truth. But Tinstar men follow you. Bring soldiers. Bring more death to our land. The youngest child, the little boy who'd stopped breathing, suddenly convulsed and went completely still. Emma's scream of anguish cut through every other sound, raw and heartbroken. She pressed her face against his tiny chest, listening desperately for any sign of life. But Minerva could see from 20 feet away that they'd lost him. The silence that followed Emma's grief was broken by Nalish's voice, now carrying a tone that suggested he'd reached some kind of internal decision. One child is already walking the spirit trail. Others will follow. Unless, he paused, looking directly at Brennan and his men, unless those who would harm children are prevented from following. Minerva understood the hidden offer, and it made her stomach turn, even as she knew its brutal logic. Minerva's voice cut through the desert air, before Nalish could give his warriors the signal to kill. No. The single word carried absolute finality, stopping everyone mid-breath. These men live, but they leave now, forever. Brennan's face showed pure confusion. He'd expected either rescue or death, not mercy from the woman he'd planned to murder. Jack looked between his marshal and the Apache warriors, calculating chances that didn't favor survival either way. The nervous rider had gone completely pale, while the educated gunman kept his hands carefully visible, and still Nalish tilted his head, truly puzzled by her decision. In Apache culture, enemies who threatened children deserved no mercy whatsoever. White woman speaks strangely. These men would have sold young ones like horses. They planned your death for land and water. Why do they deserve breath in their lungs? Emma looked up from her dead brother's body, her face streaked with tears and desert dust. Because she's not like them, she whispered, somehow understanding Minerva's choice even through her grief. She's not like them at all. Minerva kept her eyes on Nalish, knowing that the next few seconds would decide whether fairness or revenge ruled this moment. Killing them makes us no better than they are. Send them away, broken and empty-handed. That's punishment enough for cowards who prey on children. Brennan tried to speak, probably to try and bargain or threaten, but Nalish silenced him with a gesture that suggested speaking would be the last mistake he ever made. The Apache leader studied Minerva's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Woman with dead son's memory chooses mercy over blood. This speaks well of her heart, but poorly of her wisdom. The second youngest child, a girl maybe 6 years old, started making soft whimpering sounds that showed she was slipping away, as surely as her little brother had. Time was bleeding away like water through cracked clay, and every second spent on talking about what was right was a second closer to losing another innocent life. Nalish made his decision with the quick certainty of a man used to being a leader. He barked orders in Apache to his warriors, who unwillingly lowered their rifles, but kept them ready. Then he switched back to English, speaking to Brennan and his men, with a scorn that could have melted steel. Tinstar man and dog followers, you have choice. Ride north toward Mexico and never return to this territory, or stay here and feed ravens. Choose now, while woman with mercy still protects your worthless lives. Brennan's hands shook as he gathered his reins, his authority falling apart like sand and wind. Jack and the others needed no more encouragement. They made their horses go north so fast that dust clouds marked their retreat long after they disappeared beyond the horizon. But as the sound of hoofbeats faded into silence, Emma's voice rose in panic. She's not breathing. Sarah's not breathing. The 6-year-old had gone completely limp in her sister's arms, and Minerva realized with horror that mercy had cost them precious seconds they couldn't afford to lose. Nalish was already moving down from the ridge, his warriors following, but whether they came as friends or killers remained terrifyingly unclear. Nalish reached the 6-year-old girl before Minerva could move, his scarred hand surprisingly gentle as he pressed his ear to the child's chest. After a moment that felt like forever, he looked up with grim determination. Heart still beats, but barely. She needs water, shade, and medicine. We do not carry. Without hesitation, he lifted Sarah into his arms and called out something in Apache. 2 of his warriors immediately began building a quick stretcher from their spears and a blanket, moving with a skill that showed they had experience in battle. These men might be attackers, but they knew how to save lives as well as take them. Minerva knelt beside Emma, checking the remaining children, while her mind raced through how to make things work. My ranch has everything we need. Medical supplies, food, water, proper beds. But it's 8 miles through desert. That'll kill them in their condition. Nalish studied the horizon, then made a decision that surprised everyone there. Apache horses are strong. Warriors will carry children. You lead us to healing place. He looked directly into Minerva's eyes, and she saw something there that was bigger than the hate between their peoples. Children's lives matter more than old wars. The next hour blurred together in controlled chaos. Nalish's warriors worked with surprising gentleness, lifting each child onto horses and positioning them for the most comfort during the brutal ride ahead. Emma, despite her own weakness, insisted on staying awake to watch over her brothers and sisters, her 14-year-old face showing a maturity that no child should ever need. Minerva led the strange group across land that could kill those who weren't careful, her horse picking its way between rocks and cactus, while behind her, Apache warriors carried dying children with the care of protective fathers. The strange part wasn't lost on her. 5 years ago, Apache attackers had destroyed her family. Today, Apache warriors were helping her save one. By the time they reached Minerva's ranch, the sun hung low on the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of red that matched the blood she'd been trying to prevent. Her modest house looked impossibly small to shelter so many people, but Nalish's warriors immediately began the work of changing things, turning her front room into a quick medical station. Sarah was the worst, unconscious and burning with a fever that showed serious dehydration. But, as Minerva worked with herbs and clean water, Emma holding her sister's hand while Nalish translated medical instructions to his warriors, something unexpected happened. The little girl's eyes fluttered open, focused on Emma's face, and whispered a single word: sister. It took 3 more hours working by lamplight as the desert night settled around them. But little by little, each child got better. Color returned to their faces, breathing became regular, and most importantly, hope took the place of the desperate fear that had marked their near-death experience in the wild. Emma was the last to let herself rest, finally falling asleep only when she was sure that all her siblings would survive the night. As Minerva tucked a blanket around the very tired teenager, she felt something she hadn't felt in 5 years. The fierce, protective love of a mother watching over children. Nalish came quietly, his warriors already getting ready to leave. Woman, with dead son's memory, he said softly, you have new children now. Guard them well. He paused at the door, looking back one final time. Old debts are finished. New friendship begins here. As the Apache warriors disappeared into the night, Minerva stood watching over 6 sleeping children who'd become her responsibility. Her family, her chance to make things right. Tomorrow would bring new problems, legal questions about who would care for them, the need to make her home bigger, the hard job of healing hearts as well as bodies. But tonight, in the gentle breathing of children who would live to see another sunrise, she heard something that had been missing from her life for far too long. She heard hope. If you enjoyed this incredible story of survival and making things right, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing tales from the Old West. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video now.